On a crisp autumn morning at Atlanta International Airport, the bustling Terminal B was filled with the usual mix of hurried travelers and the gentle hum of rolling suitcases. Among them was Mrs. Rose Chen, a 72-year-old grandmother with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. She had been a schoolteacher for over 3 decades before retiring, and today she was making her regular trip to Chicago to visit her beloved grandchildren. The morning had started well enough. Mrs. Chen had arrived early, checked in without any issues, and even treated herself to a warm cup of tea at the airport cafe. Her arthritis was acting up a bit more than usual. The weather changes always seemed to affect her joints, but she remained cheerful, excited about the hugs and homemade cookies that awaited her in Chicago. As she approached Gate B-23, she could see Flight 2317 was already beginning its boarding process. The gate agent called for first-class passengers, followed by those needing special assistance. Mrs. Chen waited patiently for her group, holding her boarding pass in one hand and her small carry-on bag in the other. She had packed light, just a few essentials and some carefully wrapped presents for her grandchildren. When it was finally her turn to board, she moved carefully down the jet bridge, taking her time to ensure steady footing. A young man behind her offered to help with her bag, but Mrs. Chen politely declined with a warm smile. "I may be slow," she would often say, "but I'm still independent." As she reached the aircraft door, she was greeted by a flight attendant whose name read Ms. Thompson. Something about the flight attendant's expression changed ever so slightly when she saw Mrs. Chen, though most might have missed it. The smile remained fixed on her face, but it didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. "Boarding pass," Ms. Thompson said curtly, her tone notably different from the cheerful greetings she had given to previous passengers. Mrs. Chen handed over her boarding pass, maintaining her dignified composure despite the flight attendant's cold demeanor. The narrow aisle of the Boeing 737 seemed more challenging than usual to navigate. Other passengers were still settling in, some struggling with overhead bins, others checking their seat numbers. Mrs. Chen moved carefully, apologizing softly to those waiting behind her. She could hear Ms. Thompson's impatient sighs and whispered comments to another crew member. "Some people shouldn't be flying if they can't keep up," Ms. Thompson muttered, loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. A few looked up from their phones and magazines, surprised by the unprofessional comment. Mrs. Chen pretended not to hear, focusing instead on finding her seat, 14C, an aisle seat she had specifically requested. Just as she reached her row, her arthritis sent a sharp pain through her knee, causing her to pause momentarily. Ms. Thompson, who had been following closely behind, made an exaggerated show of annoyance. "We have other passengers waiting to board," she announced loudly. "You need to move more quickly." Several nearby passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. A businesswoman in 13D looked up from her laptop with concern, while a young couple across the aisle whispered to each other, clearly troubled by what they were witnessing. The tension in the air was palpable, and this was only the beginning of what would prove to be a memorable flight for everyone on board Flight 2317. What nobody knew at that moment was that this seemingly routine flight from Atlanta to Chicago would soon become a powerful example of how everyday discrimination can be confronted and overcome, thanks to the actions of ordinary people who refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. As Mrs. Chen settled into her seat, she could feel the stares of other passengers around her. Some offered sympathetic smiles, while others pretended to be absorbed in their phones or magazines, trying to avoid the uncomfortable atmosphere that had settled over their section of the plane. The businesswoman in 13D leaned back slightly and whispered, "Are you all right, ma'am? Don't let her bother you." Mrs. Chen nodded gracefully, though her hands trembled slightly as she tried to fasten her seatbelt. She had faced unkindness before, but something about being trapped in this metal tube at 30,000 feet made it feel worse. Miss Thompson continued her duties, making a show of helping other passengers with their bags and greeting them with exaggerated cheerfulness, a stark contrast to her treatment of Mrs. Chen. As she moved through the cabin, her voice dripped with honey when speaking to some passengers while turning cold and sharp for others, particularly those who looked different from her. A young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, watched the whole scene unfold from his window seat across the aisle. He tugged on his mother's sleeve and asked, quite loudly as children often do, "Mom, why is that lady being so mean to the nice grandma?" His mother quickly shushed him, but the question hung in the air, making several passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The plane was almost fully boarded when Mrs. Chen realized she needed to get something from her carry-on bag, which was stored in the overhead compartment. She pressed the call button, waiting patiently for assistance. When Miss Thompson arrived, her face immediately hardened. "Yes?" she asked, her tone making the simple words sound like an accusation. "I'm sorry to trouble you," Mrs. Chen said softly, her voice steady despite her discomfort, "but I need to get my medication from my bag above." Miss Thompson's response was immediate and harsh. "You should have thought about that before putting your bag up there. We're about to take off, and I can't have people moving around the cabin." This wasn't true. The boarding door wasn't even closed yet, and other passengers were still freely moving about. A man 3 rows ahead had just retrieved his laptop without any complaint from the crew. The businesswoman in 13D had heard enough. She stood up, her professional demeanor hiding her anger. "I'll help her," she announced firmly. "It's no trouble at all." Before Miss Thompson could object, she was already reaching for Mrs. Chen's bag. Miss Thompson's face flushed red. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. As crew member, I'm responsible for ensuring passenger safety and comfort, yes," the businesswoman completed the sentence. "Which is exactly what I'm doing since you seem unwilling to do your job properly." Other passengers began to stir. A college student pulled out his phone, quietly beginning to record the interaction. A retired nurse sitting in the row behind Mrs. Chen spoke up. "I've been watching this discrimination since boarding began. It's completely unacceptable." Miss Thompson's composure cracked slightly. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by multiple passengers at once. Her voice took on a defensive edge as she said, "I don't know what you're implying, but I treat all passengers exactly the same." A quiet voice from the back of the plane called out, "We all saw the video from when she boarded." More phones were out now, recording the unfolding scene. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. What started as uncomfortable silence had transformed into quiet solidarity with Mrs. Chen. As tension built in the cabin, the lead flight attendant, who had been busy in first class, finally noticed the commotion. She made her way down the aisle, unaware that she was about to walk into a situation that would change not just this flight, but airline policy for years to come. The lead flight attendant, Mrs. Patel, approached with a calm but concerned expression. She had over 20 years of experience and could sense the tension in the cabin before she even reached row 14. Her presence brought a momentary hush to the murmuring passengers. "What seems to be the problem here?" Mrs. Patel asked, her voice steady and professional. Before Ms. Thompson could respond, several passengers began speaking at once. "This flight attendant has been discriminating against this elderly lady," the businesswoman stated firmly, still standing beside Mrs. Chen's seat. She gestured to the phones recording the scene. "And there's plenty of evidence." The college student who had been recording spoke up, his voice clear and confident. "I have footage from when she first boarded. The difference in how this flight attendant treated her compared to other passengers is shocking." Mrs. Chen sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, maintaining her dignity despite the chaos around her. The young boy across the aisle was still watching everything with wide eyes, learning a powerful lesson about right and wrong that no textbook could teach. Mrs. Patel turned to Ms. Thompson, who had begun to realize the seriousness of the situation. "She's exaggerating," Ms. Thompson protested, but her voice wavered. "These passengers are just causing trouble. We need to prepare for takeoff." The retired nurse stood up now, her gray hair and confident posture commanding attention. "I've been traveling for 40 years, she declared. "I know the difference between normal crew behavior and discrimination. What I've witnessed today is absolutely unacceptable." A man in a business suit 3 rows ahead turned around. "I heard her muttering comments when this lady was boarding. I was going to file a complaint after landing, but since we're addressing it now." He pulled out his phone, showing he'd been taking notes of the incidents with timestamps. Mrs. Patel listened carefully to each person, her expression growing more serious with each testimony. She noticed how other passengers were nodding in agreement, how even those who hadn't spoken up were watching with concerned expressions. "Mrs. Chen," Mrs. Patel said gently, turning to the elderly woman, "would you like to tell me your side of the story?" Mrs. Chen looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "I don't want to cause any trouble," she began, but the businesswoman interrupted kindly. "You're not causing trouble." "She is," she said, pointing to Ms. Thompson. "And staying quiet about discrimination only allows it to continue." More passengers voiced their agreement. The young couple who had witnessed everything since boarding shared their observations. The mother of the young boy described how she had seen Miss Thompson roll her eyes when Mrs. Chen asked for help with her bag. As the stories poured out, Miss Thompson's face grew paler. She had clearly not expected the passengers to unite like this. She started to say something about company policy and safety regulations, but her words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Mrs. Patel held up her hand, silencing further protests from Ms. Thompson. She turned to the other flight attendant working in the back of the plane. "Please call the gate and inform them we have a situation that needs to be addressed before takeoff." The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed. What started as isolated incidents of discrimination had become a moment of unity, with strangers from all walks of life standing together against injustice. As Mrs. Patel took out her phone to call her supervisor, passengers exchanged glances of quiet satisfaction. They knew they were witnessing something important, a reminder that sometimes justice comes not from big institutions, but from ordinary people choosing to do what's right. The gate agent appeared in the cabin doorway minutes later, followed by the airline's ground supervisor, Mr. Rivera. His presence brought an air of authority to the situation. He wore a crisp navy suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to handling difficult situations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Rivera addressed the cabin, his voice calm, but carrying to every row. "I apologize for the delay. We take all reports of inappropriate conduct very seriously." Miss Thompson stood rigid by the galley, her earlier confidence completely deflated. The phones recording the scene had rattled her, but it was the unified response from the passengers that had truly shaken her composure. The college student stood up, his phone still recording. "Sir, I have video evidence from the moment this elderly lady boarded. The discrimination was obvious." He offered to show the footage, and several other passengers nodded, indicating they had similar recordings. Mr. Rivera turned to Mrs. Chen, who remained a picture of quiet dignity in her seat. "Ma'am, would you be comfortable sharing your experience with me?" Mrs. Chen looked around at all the supportive faces and sat up straighter. "When I boarded," she began softly, "I was treated differently from the moment this flight attendant saw me. I'm used to people being impatient with my slow walking. I understand everyone is busy, but this felt different." The businesswoman jumped in, her voice controlled but firm. "I watched her deny this lady basic assistance while eagerly helping others. She even prevented her from accessing needed medication, which is still in her overhead bag." Mr. Rivera's expression grew more serious. He glanced at Mrs. Patel, who nodded in confirmation of the passengers' accounts. The retired nurse added her observations, describing the pattern of behavior she'd witnessed since boarding began. The young boy across the aisle, who had been quietly watching everything unfold, suddenly spoke up again. My grandma says being mean to people because they're different is the worst thing you can do. His mother looked proud rather than embarrassed this time. Mr. Rivera surveyed the cabin, noting how many passengers were nodding in agreement. He turned to Ms. Thompson. Please gather your personal belongings and come with me. As Ms. Thompson moved to collect her things, she finally seemed to realize the gravity of her actions. Her hands trembled as she picked up her small crew bag. The magnitude of what she had done, and how many people had witnessed it, appeared to hit her all at once. Just before she left the aircraft, she turned back, perhaps to say something, but the unified stare of the passengers stopped her. The young couple who had been watching since boarding weren't holding phones anymore. They were holding hands, their expressions a mixture of satisfaction and solemnity. Mr. Rivera addressed the cabin again. I want to thank all of you for speaking up. An airline is more than just planes and schedules. It's about people, and how we treat each other matters more than anything else. A new flight attendant was already making her way down the aisle, ready to take over the flight duties. She stopped at Mrs. Chen's row and knelt down beside her seat. Ma'am, I understand you needed something from your bag. May I help you with that? The simple act of kindness, performed with genuine warmth, brought tears to several passengers' eyes. It was a powerful reminder of how things should be, and how they could be when people chose to do the right thing. As the replacement crew member helped Mrs. Chen retrieve her medication, the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. What had started as a tense confrontation was transforming into something unexpected, a moment of shared humanity and collective victory over prejudice. The delay would make them all a little late to their destinations, but not a single passenger complained. Some things, they had discovered, were more important than staying on schedule. As the plane finally prepared for takeoff, 30 minutes behind schedule, something remarkable was happening throughout the cabin. Strangers who had been absorbed in their phones or lost in their own worlds before the incident were now talking to each other, sharing their thoughts and feelings about what they had witnessed. The businesswoman had switched seats with another passenger to sit next to Mrs. Chen. I'm heading to Chicago too, she said warmly. My office is downtown. May I ask where your grandchildren live? The two women began chatting like old friends, discovering they both had family in the Lincoln Park area. The college student, who had caught everything on video, was showing his footage to the retired nurse. I've already sent it to the airline's customer service email, he explained. With everyone's recordings, there's no way they can ignore this. The young boy who had spoken up earlier was now proudly wearing a pair of pilot wings that the new flight attendant had given him. Mom, he said thoughtfully, when I grow up, I want to help people like everyone helped the nice grandma. His mother hugged him close, fighting back tears. Mrs. Patel, the lead flight attendant, made her way through the cabin with extra care and attention. She stopped at Mrs. Chen's row again. We've arranged for a wheelchair to meet you at the gate in Chicago, she explained, and the airline would like to upgrade you to first class on your return flight. Mrs. Chen tried to decline the special treatment, but the passengers around her insisted she accept it. It's not special treatment, the businesswoman pointed out. It's the airline trying to make things right. There's a big difference. The retired nurse nodded in agreement. You know, she said, addressing no one in particular, I've seen all sorts of things in my years of flying, but I've never seen passengers come together like this. She looked around the cabin with appreciation. It gives me hope. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the young couple who had witnessed everything from the beginning asked a flight attendant for a pen and paper. They started drafting a group letter to the airline's corporate office, detailing what they had seen. Other passengers began adding their names and contact information, willing to stand as witnesses. The man in the business suit who had been taking notes earlier shared something surprising. I sit on the board of a civil rights organization, he revealed. If you'd like, I can put you in touch with people who can make sure this incident leads to real change in airline policies. Mrs. Chen listened to all of this with quiet amazement. Throughout her life, She had often faced discrimination with dignified silence, choosing to move forward rather than make waves. But today was different. Today, strangers had become allies, refusing to let injustice go unchallenged. The new flight attendant, noticing that Mrs. Chen hadn't touched her coffee, brought her a fresh cup with an extra package of cookies. "My grandmother always says that sweet things help after difficult moments," she said with genuine kindness. A little girl from a few rows ahead came to show Mrs. Chen her drawing, a colorful picture of people holding hands around an airplane. "My daddy says you're brave," she explained, offering the picture as a gift. As the plane continued its journey northward, the cabin felt different from any other flight these passengers had experienced. The usual invisible walls between strangers had come down. People were sharing snacks, swapping stories, and exchanging contact information. What had started as an ugly display of discrimination had transformed into a powerful reminder of humanity's capacity for goodness. Every person on that flight knew they weren't just witnesses to an incident. They were part of a moment that would stay with them forever. The sky outside was clear and bright, much like the mood that now filled the cabin. Sometimes, as everyone on Flight 2317 was learning, it takes a dark moment to bring out the light in people's hearts. As Flight 2317 began its descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport, news of the incident had already reached the airline's corporate headquarters. The videos posted online were gaining attention, and the airline's social media team was working overtime responding to comments and messages. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their arrival. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into Chicago. The current temperature is 68 degrees, and it's a beautiful sunny day. I've been informed that there will be airline representatives meeting our flight at the gate." The businesswoman helped Mrs. Chen gather her belongings, while other passengers passed her carry-on bag down from the overhead compartment with extra care. The sense of community that had developed during the flight remained strong. "My daughter's picking me up," the businesswoman told Mrs. Chen. "We'd be happy to give you a ride to your son's house." Several other passengers had made similar offers, turning what could have been a traumatic experience into a showcase of human kindness. As promised, when the plane pulled up to the gate, there was a small group of airline officials waiting. Among them was the regional customer service director, Mrs. Anderson, a tall woman with graying hair and a warm smile. She held a tablet showing the viral videos that passengers had already shared online. The college students' recording had reached over 50,000 views in just the 3 hours they'd been in the air. Comments were pouring in from around the world, with people sharing their own experiences and praising the passengers who had stood up against discrimination. As passengers began to deplane, many stopped to give Mrs. Chen a hug or exchange contact information. The young boy who had first spoken up gave her a drawing he'd made during the flight, a picture of what he called his airplane family. Mrs. Anderson approached Mrs. Chen at the gate. "Ma'am, on behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for your experience today." She wasn't reading from a script or reciting corporate policy. Her words came from genuine concern. The retired nurse, who had stayed behind with several other passengers, spoke up. "We don't just want apologies," she said firmly. "We want to know what changes will be made to prevent this from happening to anyone else." Mrs. Anderson nodded, pulling out some official-looking documents. "We've already begun a full investigation. Ms. Thompson has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending review. But more importantly, we're launching a comprehensive review of our training programs." The business suit-wearing passenger who had mentioned his civil rights connections stepped forward. "I've already spoken with my colleagues," he said. "We're prepared to work with your airline to develop new training protocols and accountability measures." Other passengers gathered around, listening intently. The young couple who had drafted the group letter handed it to Mrs. Anderson. It now bore the signatures of nearly everyone on the flight. A local news crew had somehow gotten wind of the story and was setting up their camera near the gate. Mrs. Chen politely declined to be interviewed, but several other passengers stepped forward, eager to share how a plane full of strangers had united against injustice. The most powerful thing, the businesswoman told the reporter, wasn't just that we stopped discrimination in the moment. It's that everyone came together to ensure it leads to lasting change. The airline had arranged for a luxury car service to take Mrs. Chen to her son's house, but she accepted the businesswoman's offer of a ride instead. As they walked toward the baggage claim, followed by several other passengers who had appointed themselves as her unofficial escort, Mrs. Chen finally let herself shed a few tears. "Today showed me something beautiful," she said softly to those around her. "Sometimes the worst moments bring out the best in people." The story was already spreading beyond the airport, touching hearts and inspiring conversations about standing up for what's right. Flight 2317 would be remembered not for the discrimination that occurred, but for how ordinary people chose to respond to it. The next morning, Mrs. Chen woke up in her son's Chicago home to find her phone buzzing with messages. The video of the incident had gone viral overnight, reaching millions of views. Major news networks were running the story, focusing not just on the discrimination, but on how the passengers had united to stand against it. Her son, a software engineer, was already fielding calls from morning news shows wanting to interview his mother. "Mom," he said during breakfast, watching her calmly sip her tea, "you've become an inspiration to people all over the country." The airline's CEO had released an official statement at 6 a.m. Reading from her son's laptop, Mrs. Chen saw the words that would change company policy. "What happened on Flight 2317 is unacceptable and does not reflect our values. We are announcing immediate changes to our training programs and hiring procedures." The businesswoman who had stood up for Mrs. Chen called to check on her. "Have you seen the airline's response?" she asked excitedly. "They're creating a new passenger advocacy board, and they want you to be part of it." Outside her son's house, several news vans had gathered. The young boy and his mother from the flight lived nearby and stopped by with homemade cookies. "We saw our airplane family on TV," the boy said proudly, using his term from the flight. The college student's video had sparked a nationwide conversation. Social media was filled with stories of people sharing their own experiences with discrimination during travel. But more importantly, people were sharing stories of standing up against it. The retired nurse had already been contacted by 3 other major airlines, asking her to consult on their customer service training programs. "It's not just about preventing discrimination," she told them. "It's about creating a culture where everyone feels valued." Mrs. Chen's grandchildren were amazed to see their grandmother on television. Her 8-year-old granddaughter asked, "Grandma, are you a superhero now?" Mrs. Chen laughed and hugged her close. "No, sweetheart. The real superheroes were all the people on that plane who chose to do the right thing." The airline's investigation moved quickly. By mid-afternoon, they announced that Miss Thompson had been terminated. More importantly, they revealed plans for a complete overhaul of their training systems. The business-suited passengers' civil rights organization was already working with them to develop new protocols. The young couple who had drafted the group letter received an email from the airline's board of directors. Their suggestions for policy changes were being reviewed at the highest levels. "Your letter," the email read, "has become a blueprint for how we want to handle these situations in the future." Messages of support poured in from around the world. A group of flight attendants from another airline sent Mrs. Chen a beautiful card signed by their entire crew. "You helped us start an important conversation in our industry," they wrote. Local community organizations began calling, asking Mrs. Chen to speak at their events. Though naturally private, she realized her experience could help create positive change. "If my story can help prevent this from happening to someone else," she told her son, "then I should share it." The businesswoman organized a dinner for everyone from the flight who was still in Chicago. As they gathered at a local restaurant, they marveled at how their simple acts of standing up for what's right had sparked such widespread change. "You know what's amazing?" the retired nurse said during dinner. None of us woke up that morning planning to change the world. We just couldn't stay silent when we saw something wrong. As the sun set over Chicago that evening, Mrs. Chen sat in her son's living room, surrounded by family and new friends from the flight. The news was still running stories about Flight 2317, but she wasn't paying attention to the TV. Instead, she was listening to her granddaughter read a school essay she'd written about her brave grandmother and the airplane family who stood up for what was right. Sometimes, Mrs. Chen realized the most powerful changes start with the smallest acts of courage.